This is one of my favorite, I don't even know what we call it. I guess it's an engraving, but looks more like a poster or something we would call a poster today. Just simple, straight to the point. It's made by Ben Franklin and it's made out of frustration. And it will be used throughout not just the French and Indian War, but also, like I said, into the American Revolution. The join or die, short and sweet, right? Join or die, meaning that the colonies need to join together, fight together, or they will have to fight independently against the French and the Native Americans, and that will result in all of us dying. It's kind of like the idea of we must hang together or we will all hang separately. Again, another Ben Franklinism that he will use down the road in that Second Continental Congress. But this picture kind of says it all, right? The idea of a snake. A snake cut into a bunch of pieces is not going to be nearly as effective or as dangerous as a snake that's all put together. So I know this is kind of like a gruesome picture of a chopped up snake, but the idea, the analogy that he's going for here is going to be we must fight together in order to be effective. Now, like I told you before, the Albany Congress is somewhat of a failure because although that Albany Union, the Albany Plan of Union that Ben Franklin drafts, sounds great and everyone thinks it's good. Remember the whole their weak noodles can't, figure it out. They can't work together on this one. And that's exactly what happens here is that the representatives go back to their respective colonies and they say, hey, we got this great document. And everyone looks at it and all the colonists say the same thing. It looks like we have to give up too much power to gain this unity. We have to give too much to get something and we're not willing to do it. So every colony, one by one, returns their Albany Plan of Union to Ben Franklin and they say thanks, but no thanks. And this, of course, is going to infuriate Franklin. And eventually, in the First Continental Congress, it's going to be ammunition that Franklin uses to say, look, we screwed this up during the French and Indian War. Let's not screw this up during the American Revolution. So that's really the silver lining, but we won't know that for another couple of years. All right. Advantages. Here's something real quickly I want to talk about. The advantages of both sides during the French and Indian War. Because again, I'm not going to get into too much of the actual battles in the war itself, but I want you to see why, it was such a long-fought war. The reason why it lasted for 7 years, which is a long time. It's an eternity, with especially the death tolls that would accumulate during a war of this kind of magnitude between two European superpowers. The idea of why it lasted so long was quite simply this. Both sides had advantages. The French have, first and foremost, they were united. Unlike the British, and we just learned that they had no intentions of coming together because they wouldn't sign the Albany Plan of Union, unlike the British, the French were united and they could make a decision at a moment's notice. The king said do it, the French did it. There wasn't negotiating, there wasn't compromising, there wasn't anything like that. The French king said to do this, and so the French colonists in New France, in North America, did it. The second thing is that the French had much more land, which meant much more resources than the British. The British were kind of squished in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean, which is kind of a little foreshadowing to an advantage that the British had. But the French had all this land and all these resources. And again, finally, and probably most damaging for the British was that the French had more Native American tribes on their side. More Native American tribes meant more bodies, meant more killers, all those different things. People that knew the land, all of that was going to play a role in the French lasting or hanging with the British for as long as they did. But of course, the British do eventually win, so let's talk about why. The number one reason is that their population gravely outnumbered the French. The British had 15 times the number of soldiers that the French had. So although the French had more land and the British were squished, the idea of numbers, sheer numbers, the British had more soldiers than the French had. Now that's not counting their Native American supporters, their Native American warriors. But again, if you're looking at sheer numbers, French versus British, the British gravely outnumber the French. That was huge. And then geographically, like I said before, being packed together isn't necessarily a good thing most of the time. But in this case, it allowed for the British to communicate, even though there was this lack of, if I tell you to do something, do it. We could at least communicate faster. We knew where our people were. The French were so spread out over their land, fewer people, more square miles, that it was hard to get information, disseminate information from one point to another point. The British didn't necessarily struggle with that as much. So those are kind of like the reasons why it lasted as long as it did. But of course there are going to be game changers in this war. And I'm going to talk about three of them real quick. I'm going to start with William Pitt. William Pitt becomes the foreign minister or the prime minister over in England in the 1750s. And although that may not seem like a big deal, and really William Pitt had a lot of flaws, no doubt about it. He made a lot of empty promises to the colonists, and he wasn't all that well liked for the majority of his rule in England. The bottom line was he did one important thing, and that was, at least in the minds of the colonists, he did one important thing. He convinced the king to stay in this war. By the 1750s, this war seemed like it was over. By 1757, the French had won basically every battle. They were crushing the British at every turn, and the king's ready to pull the plug. The King of England is ready to say, forget it, we tried it, it didn't work, oh well, back to the drawing board, and pull all the colonists out, and if not pull them out, at least stop supporting them. And it's William Pitt who basically is able to calm the king down a little bit and convince him that this is a huge mistake. We cannot pull out of this war. Yes, things don't look good right now, but if we pull out of this war right now, think about what that does. Not only how does that affect us economically, I mean, all the money that we're going to lose from trading with the colonists and all the tobacco that's coming out of the colonies that the British love and they can't get enough of. Throw that to the side here. But the biggest issue was if we stop supporting the British here and we just allow the colonists to kind of fight the French on their own and let the French win, the French gain North America. And with that gain of North America, they become truly the it country in the world. I mean, they become the international powerhouse. So William Pitt convinces the king to stop doing this, and the king listens to him and says, you know what, you're right. Thanks for talking me off the ledge. And as a result of that, the king starts sending not only more money, but troops and supplies. And of course, it turns the tide of the war. Right around that same time, the Iroquois, led by Joseph Brant, decide that they've punished the colonists enough. They've stayed out of this war long enough, and they say, you know what, you snubbed us back at the Albany Congress, but we're over it now. We're ready to come fight. And of course, that was well-needed warriors joining the British side and allowing them to, again, turn the tide of this war and start winning some battles. And then finally, Quebec falls. Finally, the British are able to sneak into Quebec, which was the capital of New France, and take down the government, the French government there, defeat them, take out all the communication, that was their communication hub, take out all of that communication that was coming from France to Quebec, and then from Quebec being sent out to all the different French soldiers. That no longer was, that centralized communication was no longer an advantage to the French. They didn't have it anymore, and this becomes, from the fall of Quebec on, it becomes very clear that the British are going to win this war. So let's talk about how the war ends. There's a treaty, and it's called the Treaty of Paris, and there are 5 parts to it, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but I just want you to see what happens. First and foremost, the Treaty of Paris ends the war like any treaty does. It officially says stop killing each other, and they do, for the most part. The British and the French, that is. The second part of it is that Britain gains Canada and all French lands west of the Mississippi River. Again, by doing this, it allows for the the British to expand their borders from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Remember, prior to this war, it was the Atlantic Ocean to the Appalachian Mountains. Not only do we expand our borders and gain lots of new land, lots of French land, but the most important thing is we gain that Ohio River Valley, or at least it seems at the time to the colonists that the most important thing is we gain the Ohio River Valley. Remember all that fur trade, all that profit. The third thing that comes out of this treaty is that France was allowed to keep 2 islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, as well as its rich sugar-growing islands in the West Indies, places down like Haiti and the Dominican Republic today, as well as up in some islands off the coast of Canada. And we call this saving face. The British understood this, as every other country did, that what you do when you win a war, when you punch someone in the face, you say you're sorry afterwards. When you do that, the effects, yes, I just got punched in the face, and yes, it did hurt, just like the French. They just lost this war, and they lost all of these things. At least the French are able to go back to France, or the colonists were able to go back to France and say, yes, we lost, but we were able to keep these very profitable sugar plantation islands. Isn't that good news? So we're able to go back and say, we didn't lose everything. Again, I guess punching someone in the face and saying I'm sorry isn't maybe enough. Maybe I punch you in the face and then I give you $100. If I do that, maybe you don't feel the pain as much as the punch in the face, or maybe you punch me back. I don't know. But anyways, for the French here, they were able to save some face going back to France. The fourth thing on this list here is that Spain, which had entered the war late in the war, and they enter on the wrong side. Spain's kind of a non-factor in this war, but for whatever reason, they joined the French side in 1762. They decide, hey, we're going to jump in and we're going to help the French defeat the British. That seems like a good idea. Well, it was a bad idea, because by joining the war, not only do they not help the French, but they now get clumped into the losing side. So Spain is forced to cede or give up Florida. They had to give Florida to Britain. Again, it made sense. We owned all the land east of the Mississippi River except Florida. It didn't really bode well for the British, so they just go and they take Spain, or they take Florida, saying to Spain, you joined the wrong side, you got to pay the price. And the final thing that happens here is that Spain received all French lands west of the Mississippi, including the valuable port of New Orleans. Now again, this is saving face all over again. We say to the Spanish, here's the punch in the face, we're going to take Florida from you, but here's sort of a little gift. We're going to give you all that land west of the Mississippi River. And the reason why we're doing it, it doesn't matter, but between you and I, the reason why they were doing it is because, A, they didn't think they needed that land west of the Mississippi River. They just gained a huge chunk from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. They didn't think they needed it anymore, at least not at that time. But B, they knew that Spain was going to be their neighbor for a long time to come. And they wanted to be nice to their neighbor, and they wanted to have good relations with their neighbor. So we're going to take something, but we're going to give you something. And any of you guys who have bad neighbors, you understand that having bad neighbors stinks. It really stinks because you go outside every day, you see them, they give you dirty looks, all that stuff's no fun. So anyways, we knew that Spain was going to be our neighbor for a long time to come, so we make peace with them, we make nice with them. All right, the last slide, and here's William Pitt again, sitting there. It looks like he's sort of contemplating something real serious here, and he probably is, because what happens here is, at the end of this war, we receive a lot of death and debt. The British, that is. We win the war, and everyone says, yay! But what a lot of people forget is no matter what war it is, there's always going to be these two Ds that result from any war. Even if you win, there's going to be death and there's going to be debt. There are very few wars out there, none that I can think of off the top of my head, where no one dies and no one ends up, even the winning side, owing money or spending a ton of money that now they need to recoup. So with that being said, William Pitt now looks at what happened in the colonies, and after they celebrate and high-five everyone and get real excited about it, they have to deal with these two sort of results of any war, the dead people and the debt that ensues. So what's going to happen next is going to be what really spurs on the American Revolution. A lot of people forget, and they just say, oh, taxation without representation. That's why the American Revolution was fought, or it was the Boston Massacre or the Boston Tea Party. There are lots of events that we can point to, but time and time again, historians alike and students certainly forget that the French and Indian War is really the reason why the king and parliament and really the British as a whole need to recoup money from the French and Indian War. They need to get that money back, and the best way that any government can do that is by taxing. It just so happened that they were taxing the colonies without having the colonies represented in Parliament, and that leads to that catchphrase of taxation without representation, which of course is going to be the rally cry for the colonists and the patriots alike to go to war with their mother country. So the question now is going to be how the British are going to get themselves out of debt. How are we going to make good on this? How are we going to reap the benefits of this French and Indian War? Well, we're going to tax the colonists. So this is going to be the lead-off for next class. When you guys come in tomorrow or the next day, depending whether you're odd or even, I want to talk about taxation without representation and whether it was a good idea or a bad idea and whether the colonists really did have any right to rebel against their mother country because they weren't represented. So what? So keep that in mind as you're stewing over this French and Indian War. And although it was a great success for the British, there certainly were going to be consequences that would be long-standing. This war ends in 1763, and again, what we have here is about 20 years or so, maybe 15 years, until we actually get to the American Revolution and the outcomes of the American Revolution. All right, see you in class.